Hey guys, what's up? So welcome to this tutorial series on Flask. So in this tutorial series, we are going to be building a link bookmarking API such that users can be able to save links that they may want to check out in the future. So our backend is going to be multi-user, meaning that we are going to need a way for users to be able to create accounts and also to log in. So when they log in, we will be giving them an access token that they can use to access the protected endpoints, like the ones to create a bookmark, to retrieve all bookmarks. So we'll also have another endpoint that is going to be used to refresh a token. For security purposes, the access token that we get on login will be short-lived. So whenever a user logs in, we are going to give them a pair of keys, an access token and a refresh token. So whenever the access token expires, we are going to be using that refresh token to make a call to the token refresh endpoint, where we can get a new access token and keep our users logged in. What we are looking at right now is the API documentation, and we are going to be using Swagger to document it. So every endpoint we add in the backend will have to be documented somehow, such that we can be able to give this documentation to like other developers that might want to make a mobile app for this API, or if they want to make a front end using React or Angular or Vue or whatever the front end developers love these days, they can use this to know how to talk to our API and they can make it work for the user. So here in Postman, you can see that over here we go ahead and make a request to the sign up endpoint, and we get a 201 created, which means that a resource was created on our server, and then we get a response of that user sent back. And then on the endpoint to login, we get the 2 tokens, and then we get the other extra users information who has logged in. And then with these tokens, we can start to access protected endpoints, like this one to get a list of bookmarks, this one to add a bookmark. One thing you'll notice here is on the payload of a single bookmark, we have a short URL and a long URL, and also we have the visits property. So the visits property is used to track how many times we visited this URL, because it's common that we might bookmark things but we might not check them out. So this is going to be used to give the user an insight on the things they have not checked out. So the way we are doing that is by, in the backend, implementing a URL shortener service. So over here you can see that we have a field for the short URL. So whenever a user enters a URL like this, we go ahead and shorten it on our server, and on our server we create a unique URL for it. So now when I try to access, let's say I want to access this localhost port 55/Z5B, if I go to like Chrome and I type it like here, notice that this should be going to our local server, but when I click there, you notice that it goes to our server and then it redirects here to the real URL. So this way we are able to tell that the user actually checked out one of the links they bookmarked by having to implement the shortener service. So it's quite interesting how it's implemented. So I'm sure you're going to learn some cool things as we implement that. Now over here we have an endpoint for retrieving the stats. You can see that for each of the URLs we can track how many times it was visited, such that maybe on the front end we can sort our bookmarks by the ones we've not checked out. So we make our backend API more flexible and more realistic. So that is going to be it for the introductory video. If you're really interested in building these kinds of apps, I highly recommend you subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to be releasing a lot of videos showing you guys how to build these kinds of APIs, mobile apps, web apps from scratch. So please consider subscribing. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and create our Flask project and make sure that we can get started writing code. So to get started, the only requirement you're going to need here is Python. So make sure you have Python installed. When you install Python with the normal process, you're going to have pip, and then we are going to be using pip to install our project dependencies like Flask and alike. So to get started, I'm here in my terminal. So if you're on Mac or Linux, open up your terminal. If you're on Windows, open up your command prompt. So first, you want to verify that you have Python. So go ahead and type in Python in your terminal. When I type in Python, you can see that I get the Python shell open up. By default, it opens up Python 2. So this is not what we want. So I'm going to quit here. Now on Mac or Linux, when you install Python 3, you can use that by typing in Python 3. So when I type in Python 3, you can see that I have Python 3.7.7. So let me just quit this one again. So verify that you have Python. So if I do Python 3 -- version, you can see that I have you can see my version. Now, to check if you have pip, you can type in pip. So since I'm using a Mac, you can type in pip3 -- version, and then you can see that we get pip3 version being listed. So if you're on Windows, be sure to type in pip or Python without putting the 3. It should be able to work automatically if you install following the default process. So once you have that, we are going to need a way to manage our virtual environment. Now, if you think about Python projects, you might be working on like 2 or 3 Python projects on your computer. And a lot of the times you want each of those projects to have its own dependencies in one place, such that you can be able to move the project around computers or even put it on a server for hosting without having to look for the packages again. So we are going to be creating a virtual environment that will hold all our project dependencies. Now, for us to create a virtual environment, we are going to be using a tool called virtualenv. So if you're on Mac or Linux, go ahead and install it using pip3. So you can type in pip3 install virtualenv like this. So go ahead and run that. So when I run that, you can see that mine finished so fast because I already had it. On Windows, go ahead and type in pip install virtualenv. So once you install that, now we can use virtualenv to create a virtual environment. So over here, I'm first going to create a folder that will contain all our project files. So I'm going to call this bookmarks REST API, and then I'm going to cd into it. So bookmarks. So now that we are in our bookmarks REST API, we can go ahead and create our virtual environment in here. So to create a virtual environment, we can use the tool we just installed. So type in virtualenv, and then you give it an environment name. So mine is going to be called venv, like this. Notice how I'm unable to create it like this. So if you ever face that issue, be sure to run this using Python 3. So you can do Python 3 minus m. M is for module, signifying that we want to run this module using Python 3. So I'm going to run that. And when you run that, you can see that now if I do an ls, on Windows you have to type in like a dir to see if the folder was created. So if I do an ls, you can see that now we have the folder for our virtual environment, and now we need to activate it. So now to activate it on Linux, go ahead and type in source, then venv, then go to bin, then you want to source in the activate script, this one. So when I do that, you can see that my virtual environment is activated, and we can tell by seeing the name of the virtual environment here. So if you ever want to maybe deactivate it, you can type in deactivate, and it should deactivate it. So if you're on Windows and you try typing in source, it will not work. Be sure to cd into your virtual environment, then scripts, then activate.bat file, and then you should be able to see that your virtual environment is activated like this. So now we are here. If we do a Python -- version, you can see that the Python we're using now is the one that is tied to our project, and we don't have to do Python 3 anymore. And if you ever wanted to know which Python you're using or where the Python you're using is, you can type which Python, and then you should be able to see where it is. So the one we're using is in our virtual environment. So good. Now let's go ahead and install Flask. So to install Flask, go ahead and do pip install Flask like this. So it's going to go ahead and install Flask. So Flask also uses some other dependencies. So you can see that it installs like Ginger 2, it's dangerous, click, typing extensions. Flask also depends on this. Now our project also depends on this with Flask. So now that we have Flask installed, I'm going to open up this project in VS Code. So on my computer, I can type in code. And then it should be able to open in VS Code. So you can see here, we have our project, and then we have the virtual environment. So I'm going to open the integrated terminal in VS Code, because with this one, I don't have to switch between windows. I can just work in one editor and things will be fine. So over here, the first thing you're going to need to do is we are going to create an entry point to our server. So out here, I'm going to create a file called app.py. So in the app.py, this is where we're going to be writing our Python code. But before we do that, let me go ahead and activate my virtual environment again, because when you open a new terminal session, you have to reactivate the virtual environment. So let me go ahead and do that. So source. So now we are going to go ahead and create a very basic Flask app. So to create a very basic Flask app, we are going to import Flask from Flask. So from Flask, import Flask. So here we need to create an instance of Flask, and that will be our app. So you can do like app equals Flask, and then we pass in _name _. So when we instantiate Flask, it needs a way to know where it is being configured from, and that's why we pass in this danda name danda. So once we are done with this, now we can go ahead and recreate a very basic route. So this can sometimes be called an endpoint, and we can create that by using the app, and then we use a decorator. We do app dot, and then after this we do an HTTP method. So for example, if we wanted to do a GET request, we'll do app.get, and then inside here, and then we define the route. So we are going to listen for when a user goes to our homepage, and then we're going to create a function to handle that. So here we can just have a function. So for this function, we're going to just be returning hello world, like this. So don't mind this. So now to be able to test out our application, to be able to run it, we need to go in our terminal, and then we need to tell Flask a few things. One of them is going to be the environment we are running in. So over here we can do export flask _env. Then we are going to set that one to development. So by default, Flask will assume that we are running in production. So you need to tell it that we are running in development so that it can give us like debugging errors and all that stuff. So let's run that. So another thing we need to define is the path to our Flask app. So we can do that by doing export Flask app, and that will be the path to the module that has our Flask app. In our case, it is app. So we can do app like this, and now we can run Flask run in our terminal. And once we run that, you should be able to see that we have serving Flask app, and then we have the environment you're running on, which is development, and then that turns on like debug mode and all this other stuff. So now if we click on this URL and come to the browser, you can see that we have our hello world. Now the browser can only help us to do GET requests, but later we're going to be looking at how to use Postman to also work with other methods like post or delete or get. So let's have another basic endpoint over here. So I'm going to have /hello. So since we are going to be building an API, then it makes sense to start working with JSON already. So over here, so Flask comes with some utilities that can enable us to work with JSON, and one we are going to be working with is JSONify. So we want, when a user goes to the /hello route, we want to send them a message. So we're going to send back a Python dictionary. Now we can do JSONify here. We can wrap everything here in JSONify. So we're going to change the function name that handles it so they don't collide. So we're going to have say hello. So we're going to have say hello on there. And now if we go back to our application and now we go to the hello route, you can see that we get JSON being sent back to us. So one thing here that I want to point out is, so by default, Flask is going to format this into JSON even when we don't use JSONify. So even if we take this one away, so let me take this one away again and come back over here to /hello, you can see that it works the same. So the Python dictionary is directly mapped to a JSON object, and we don't really have to do any other extra serialization for this. So that's gonna be it for the setup. If you're on Windows and you get any issues, be sure to check the description. I will leave some tips in there. Also check the comments, because I'm sure some guys are gonna be laying down how things should be done. Hey, welcome back guys. So in this one we're going to be talking about quite a number of things. One is we're going to work on our folder structure, make sure we are structuring things very well. And then we are going to see an alternative way to set up an app by using factory functions. And also we are going to be taking a look at the Flask env and how to manage environment variables. So over here what we did was we created an instance of our app by just setting it to Flask, and then we are using this app almost everywhere. So we could go ahead here and we connect our app to like a database and all that stuff. But that approach will have some drawbacks, because that way we might not be able to easily test our application. What we're going to do now is we're going to set it up in a way that it can accept different configurations depending on how it is being run. So over here, I'm going to start by creating a few files and folders. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an SRC folder. So the SRC folder will host all our application code. So all the code we write will go in the SRC folder. So over here, I'm going to move this app, of course, now to the SRC, because now all our application code will be here. And then over here, I'm going to create some other folders. One is going to be the config folder. So the config folder will host all the boilerplate configuration for the different modules we are going to be working with. So also I'm going to create another folder here called constants. So inside here we can have some constants, for example some variables that we don't want them, so we don't want to change across our apps. For example the status code. So I'm just gonna create here status codes dot py file already. So I'm actually gonna prefix it with HTTP just so we don't confuse that. And then the other folder I'm going to create here is the static and the templates folder. So these we can use them if we wanted to show like a web page, maybe a welcome page. It would need us to have like some CSS, so we'll put it in here. Then we also have some templates. So in the templates we can have some HTML if we needed to. So also I'm going to create a services folder. So in the services, let's say we wanted to send an email to the user when they sign up, we could have like an email service inside there. So one thing I'm going to do is outside the SRC, I'm going to create a tests folder. So I'm going to have tests there. So if we wanted to write some unit tests or some other types of tests, we will put them in there. And now in the source, this is where we're going to create our factory function, the one that is going to set up our app. So over here, I'm going to create a danda init file. So this is the file. You can think of this as the default file. So whenever we're importing from source, we don't have to put danda init. Every time we import from source, this is going to be imported automatically. So over here, we're going to have a function that's going to be responsible to create our app, set up some configurations, and then return it to us, depending on how we intend to call that function. So this function is going to be called create app. Now, this function is going to be taking in a config. Now, the common two cases that I find when writing apps is when you have to configure it for testing or when you want to use it as a user. So over here, when we call it, we're going to be passing it a test config. So I'm going to set it to none by default. So over here now we can create our app just like the way we did it in app. So let's import this. Actually, let's just import all this because we're going to need to do the same thing. I always love to have all my imports on top, although with Python you can have them anywhere. So we're going to have app equals Flask. And then I'm going to pass in another argument here. And that argument is going to be instance relative config. So instance relative config, and then we're going to set that one to true, and that just tells Flask that we might have some configurations that are going to be defined in some files outside here. So now that we have that, then we can go ahead and check if we are running in testing or if we have some testing config. So we can say if testing is none, we can go ahead and configure our app. Now one thing I'm going to configure quickly is the secret key. So over here we can do app.config. Then we want to do from mapping. So when we do from mapping, then we can pass in our configurations. So for now, I'm going to set the secret key. So I'm going to do secret key, and then I'm going to set that one to dev for now. And then later, I'm going to be showing you how to use environment variables to pull this one in. If you wanted to like set up a database or maybe configure our app to use our app to work with another module, we'll be doing that in this block. But if the test config is defined, then we are going to go ahead and have an else here, and then we are going to be running our app using that configuration. So we can do app.config.fromMapping, and then we can use the one that we passed in when we created our app. We need to return our app, so we can do return app like this. Now in the app.py, since we have these functions of ours, right now we have another instance of our app, so we are going to clear this one away. And to keep things working, over here in our app, we are going to have this defined. So let's push them in here. So we can have the @index and this and the @error. And now we need to tell Flask to now use this file as our main app entry point. So I'm going to stop the server and run export Flask app, and then we can. So now we are going to set our new path, which is in SRC. So we can do Flask app equals SRC. And now if we run back our app, Flask run, you can see that our server is still on. And when we come over here, you can see that we still have our hello world, and we can still go back to /hello and get the message, so which is good. One thing you must have noticed is I had to update Flask in the terminal by setting the path to the Flask app again. What happens is whenever we want to run, let's say Flask run in another terminal, now let's say we wanted to rerun this app in a new terminal, so I'm going to go to a new one, a fresh one. So if we do Flask run over here, it doesn't locate the Flask application. So instead of us having to go ahead repeating this, setting the Flask app, setting the environment every time we have a new terminal session, what we can do is we can create a special file called .flaskenv. So in the flaskenv file, then we can have all our configurations, the one we are setting from the terminal. So let's set the environment. So export Flask env equals development. Let's also set the Flask app, so export Flask underscore app. Then this is going to be src. And now if we come back to a new terminal session, in fact, I'm going to create a new one. And now if we do Flask run, you'll notice that they tell us that there is a .env or a flaskenv file. And for Flask to be able to work with this new file, we need to have python.env installed. So I'm going to copy this command here and run that in our environment, just so we can get it installed. So it's going to go ahead and install that. So when it's done and we run back our Flask, notice that now our application starts and it picks up the config. So it's now using development, and we don't have to actually go ahead and set these ones again every time we are rerunning it in a new terminal session. So that's how you do that. One thing I want to say about the .flaskenv file is that .flaskenv file is not a replacement for a .env file. So in the flaskenv file, we can have some configurations that we might be free to even push to version control. Now also, we might have some files that we might not want to push to version control, and those we can put them in a .env file. So I'm going to create a .env file. So here I'm going to have export secret key, and we're going to talk more about secret keys in a few. And now here where we set up our application with the secret key, instead of us using this hard-coded one, I'm going to use an OS module to read from the current .env. So I'm going to import OS here, so import OS. And over here, then we can set this one to os.env environ. Then we can do get. Then we can get the key. So our key is secret key. So we can make sure that we are getting that secret key. So that's how you get started with application factory functions, and also how to work with environment variables. So if the video helps you out, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye. Hey guys, welcome back. So in this one, we're going to go ahead and start modularizing our project by using Blueprints. So with Blueprints, we can be able to create different modules that then we can register with our main Flask app, so we can keep our application modular. One thing you have to keep in mind is Blueprints are meant to group related functionality together. So you don't have to have like a blueprint for users, and then in the users you're doing like a product list. So you always want to make sure that each blueprint is containing code that is related to each other. So instead of us having these routes here, these were for testing, I'm going to get rid of them. So to get started creating our first blueprint, we are going to have a user's blueprint and also the bookmarks blueprint. So in the source, I'm going to create an auth.py file and also the bookmarks.py file. Now to define a blueprint, we are going to need blueprint. So from Flask, import blueprint. Okay, so to create our own, we're going to call our own auth, and then we want to call blueprint. And then when you call this, notice that we can pass in some config, and the one that is very obvious is the name. So we can do name. So we can do name equals auth, or we can just pass it in since it's positional. So let's call this one auth, and then we need to tell it where it is being run from. So we can do that by passing kind of name, and then we can pass other configuration. For example, notice that on our API, for us to hit the endpoints that are going to be in auth, we are going to be doing like our app/API/v1/auth. So we can specify a URL prefix. So here we can have something like /API/v1/auth. And now once we define a blueprint, then we can have routes on it. So if we wanted to handle like a register or a sign up request, we would have @auth. Then we can handle .post. And then for this, then we can detect when a user is going to register. And then we can handle that like this. So let's have function register. And then over here, we can return something like user created. And then of course we're going to be coming back here to make sure we can put there some meaningful logic. Let's also have a function that gets the current logged in user. For it, it's going to be a get. So we can have @auth.get. So we can have like /me. Then we can have a function to handle that. So we can have like me. You can return user. We can return there like user. me. Okay, so we are going to now create the same thing. This should be register. We're going to now create a blueprint for our bookmarks. So we can go to our bookmarks.py and have the same thing. So we're going to change auth to bookmarks almost everywhere. So we can change this one to bookmarks. So what we're doing, we are getting the blueprint just so we can create a blueprint. And then we are creating a bookmarks blueprint. Then we are prefixing all the URLs to just start with API v1 bookmarks. And then over here, we can just do /register, and that is going to be appended here. So we don't have to repeat this part more than once. So here, let's just have a get. Let's just bookmarks get slash, and then this should return. And then let's call this one index. Or we can call this one get or. Let's just return an empty list. So, and then we're going to be adding to this later. So after you find your blueprints, then you want to register them on your app instance. So here, before we return our app, let's go ahead and import our blueprints. So from source.auth, we're going to use an absolute import. So we're going to do import auth. Let's also import bookmarks. So from source bookmarks import bookmarks. So over here, before we return the app, we can just do app.register blueprint, and then we want to register the auth one, and then we're going to have to register the bookmarks one. Okay, so once we're done with this, now we can go back to our application. So I'm going to go to the application over here, and now if we go to /API/v1/me /auth/me, notice that we get our code from the blueprint being executed. And now if we go to /bookmarks, the index route, you can see that we get an error. So let's check why we have this error here. So in bookmarks, we are just returning a list, so we can't return it like this. So what you can do is we return a dictionary with a key and a value. So we can have like bookmarks in here, and then we set that one to empty. So if we come back and refresh this, you can see that now we get the response being sent. So that's how we modularize our app. Now there's more config we can set here. So be sure to look up how to maybe do something with blueprints if you have a special use case. So I hope this was helpful. If it was, consider giving the video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next video. Hey guys, welcome back. Last time we were able to organize our application using blueprints. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and set up a database that's going to be able to contain our data about users and also bookmarks. So we are going to be using Flask SQL Alchemy, which is an extension for Flask that adds support for SQL Alchemy. So SQL Alchemy facilitates connecting Python programs to different databases, and it can also be used as an object relational mapper, which gives us a layer of abstraction when we are interacting with databases from our applications. So we don't have to write like the nitty-gritty details of the SQL. So we can just focus on writing our Python code and move faster. So over here in our source, I'm going to create a file called database.py. Now we need to first install Flask SQL Alchemy. Now to install this, we want to run pip install Flask SQL Alchemy. So I'm going to stop my server arm here. Make sure you're still in your virtual environment, and then run this installation command. So after it installs, the first thing we're going to need to do is to set up our DB and then tell SQL Alchemy on how to connect to it. So we're going to be using SQLite, which is a file-based relational database. So good thing with this is it comes bundled with Python already, so we don't have to go through the process of installing Postgres or MySQL. And you will see that for the case we are going to be doing here, we can pretty much do it with any kind of database, but be sure to not use a file-based database when you're going to make a big app or the app you're going to put to production. So over here, to get started, we want to import SQL Alchemy from Flask SQL Alchemy. So what we need to do here is we need to create our DB, and then we set it to SQL Alchemy. And then once we create our DB, then on the DB we have access to the model class that enables us to define how our relations would look like. So over here we can create a class. So this class we can call it user. So we're gonna now define how our user relation is gonna be, or our user table. So we're gonna inherit from db.model. Okay, so down in here now we can define our columns. So for the columns we're gonna of course have an ID. So that will be like the unique identifier for each user. So here we can say db.column. So for the user, we want the user to be, so we want the ID to be an integer, for example 1 2 3 4 5. So here we can do db.integer, and then we are going to set primary key equals true, and this is going to enable SQL argument to restrict this to only contain unique values. Also, it's going to, also since it's an ID, it's going to be assigned automatically by incrementing the ID of the previous object. It's going to be managed behind the scenes for us. Then the next thing we're going to have is the username. So over here, we can specify a username. So the username is going to be a string. So we have string, and then inside here we can define how long we want it to be, like the maximum number. So let's have our usernames to be less than 80. So it's not going to be primary, but it's going to be unique. So we don't want our users to have the same usernames. So next thing we're going to have to define is the email. So we also have to specify that this shouldn't be null. So we don't want to create a user without a name. So we can specify nullable equals false. Okay. So let's also specify the email. So I'm going to change this one to email. So it's going to be a string, yes. Now an email might be longer, but let's just take our hours to 120. It should be unique. It also shouldn't be nullable. Let's also define the user's password. So for the password, it can be a string. We also have another type for text. So that allows you to store strings without having to limit them. So for the password, of course, we don't want it to be unique because we're going to be actually hashing it, as you will see. We won't be storing it as like plain text. So let's also go ahead and define the creator dat. It's very important. We get to know when this was created. So for the type, it's going to be a datetime field. We want every time a user is created, we want to enter this automatically using the current date at that time, using the current date at that moment. So over here, we can also specify a default, and then we can set this one to datetime.now. So I'm going to import datetime up here, import datetime. Then we can set this one to datetime.now. Okay, so we'll also have the updated dat. So I'm going to duplicate this. So this is going to keep track of when this item was just updated. So updated dat will be the datetime, but here we can specify on update, and then on update we'll also be inserting in time at that point. So one thing that we'll most likely want to do is create a single representation, a string representation of our model class. So over here, I'm going to have a wrapper method. So for this one, we're going to be returning self.username. So to make this one look better, I'm going to use f strings here. So I'm just going to do this. Then here, I'm going to have user. Now we have this. Then for the dynamic variable, you can put it in this curly brackets. So this is how the class would look. Now we are going to be adding there some other relationships. But let's first go and define our relation for the bookmarks. So we're also going to have a class called bookmark. Now, you notice that the way we are naming our module classes, we are just using like singular terms. Just like other Python classes, these are no exception. They have to follow the standard convention of naming classes. That's why we name it as a single entity. So now let's go ahead and define how our bookmarks will be. So first off, we're going to have an ID. So the ID is going to look similar to this. I'm just going to bring this one in. Then the next thing we're going to have is the body of a bookmark. So someone can add some details. So body, we can just get the text. So let's make it nullable. So if a user doesn't provide it, the app shouldn't complain. So let's also pick the URL. That is very important to us. That is what makes our application work. So for the URL, we will keep a text and we want it to always be there. We are going to need to have a way of getting a short URL version of our main URL. So that is something we're going to be adding within our application, so the user won't have to supply it. But for the constraints here, we're going to use a string, and for this, it's going to be a maximum of 3 characters. So when we generate it, we are going to always make sure it is string before we insert it here. Another thing we are going to define is the visits. So we're also going to have to track how many times a bookmark was checked out. So for the visits, we can have db column. It's going to be an integer. Let's set a default. So default is going to be 0. Now let's have the updated data and created data. So they're going to be the same. So I'm going to copy these and also bring them here. So let's now talk a bit about relationships and how we can create a relationship between a user and a bookmark such that querying our records becomes more efficient. So what we're going to do here on a bookmark, we're also going to specify a user ID. And then this is going to be an integer field. So here we can do db.integer. We will also specify that it's going to be a foreign key. So we'll do db.foreign key. Now, when you do db.foreign key, then you can specify the table that you're referencing in here and the column. So since we are referencing this class here, we can go ahead and specify that we are referencing user. Then we can specify that this user ID will be matched with a specific column on this class. So that's going to be the ID column. So on here you can do a .id. Now the next thing we're going to do is on the user class, we're also going to define a relationship with the bookmarks. So over here, I'm going to have a bookmarks. So for the bookmarks, we're going to set that one to db.relationship. So for the relationship, then we can specify the class that we are creating this relationship with. So that's going to be the bookmark one. And then over here, I'm going to specify a keyword called backref. Then I'm going to set that one to user. Now this keyword here is just another way for defining a reverse relationship. So this way, we don't have to come on here and we specify that there is another relationship. And this is going to take care of us being able to do bookmark.user. So just the same way we'll be able to do user.bookmarks, this allows us to now also be able to do bookmark dot then what we specify here. So now that we have that out of the way, let's also have a ripper method for our bookmark. So we have a ripper, then we just have bookmark. We can just return anything here. Let's just get the ID or the URL. That looks better. So one thing we're going to need here is we're going to need a way of creating a short URL from a URL that is given to us. Now, whenever an object is being created or when our class is being instantiated, the constructor gets called. So over here, we're going to override danda init. Now, we're going to be taking in self and all the other keyword arguments. Now, over here, we are going to find a way of assigning a short URL when this object is being created. So here, we're going to do self.short URL equals, so I'm going to have a function called generate short URL. It could even be generate short characters because in essence we're actually getting a character. So I'm going to change this one to short characters. So let's create this. Now since we are in a class, we're going to have to call it using self. So we'll have def generate short characters. So text in self, just so it can access all these other members. So thinking about how we are going to do it, we are going to find a way of getting all the possible characters and picking random 3 from those possible characters. And the ones we pick, we need to make sure that we had not picked them before. So first off, we need to get our numbers from 0 to 9. Now we can get numbers by using the string class. So over here, let me import string. So import string. So if I go down here, now to get numbers from 0 to 9, with characters equals string. Then on the string, we call digits. So this is going to give us 0, 1, 2 up to 9. And then what I want us to do is also add all our alphabet letters from A to Z. So we can get all the alphabet letters by calling string.ascii letters. On this very note, I'm going to introduce you to the Flask shell. So with Flask, you can just run Flask shell, and that's going to take you to like a Python shell. But in here, you can go ahead and you import everything in your app. You interact with it as if it's a real Flask app being run. So that's why. So I'm going to import string just so we see how that works. So if we do string.digits, you see we get 0 to 9. And now if we do string.ascii letters, so just do ASCII letters, you can see we have A to Z and then we have the version where the letters are, and then we have the versions where the letters are uppercase. Now for us to pick random 3 letters from this, what we're going to do is here we're going to import random, and then we're going to be using choice from random to pick them. So down here I'm going to have pictures. We'll set that one to random dot choices. So if we do random dot choices, then we can give it like where we want to pick from. So we want to pick from characters, and then we can pass another key for the weights. So the key specifies how many we want to pick from there. Now we can say we want to pick 3. So if I did this, if I came here and imported random, so if I import random down here, and then I did random dot choices, and then let's just pass the letters ASCII letters. So I'm gonna pass them in there. So let's pass k equals 3. So when we do that, you notice that it gives us a new list. Now what we want is to turn this. Now what we want is a way to turn this into a string and not a list. So we can do that by using join. So we join by an empty string. So we can do empty string dot join, and then we can go ahead and join this. So I'm gonna copy all this and paste it in there and run this. And now you can see that we get our 3 strings in a string format. So that's what we're gonna do here. So over here I'm gonna do this dot join, then we're gonna join this. So that's going to give us our 3 strings. Now something we're going to need to do, this should be picked. Now something we're going to need to do is make sure that this don't exist already in a DB, otherwise our link tracking may not work well. Over here we're going to have a link that exists, so we're going to do link. So we're going to set this one to self, and then we can access query when we are on a model. So self.query, and then we can do filter by. So here we want to filter by this short URL. So before we insert a short URL, we want to make sure it's not there. So we can filter by short URL equals the picked characters. Then we want to call first on it. It's going to return for us a valid bookmark, or it's going to return none if none exists. So here we can check if we have the link. So if we have the link, then we want to try getting another one. Then otherwise our short URL will equal to the characters we just picked. So over here we can have an else, and then we just return this. So if it exists, we are going to try to find it again and again until we get one that doesn't exist. So over here we can just recall the same function. So we're going to do self.generate short cases, and then it's going to retry until it gets a unique one. So now that we are done with this, we are pretty much done. So one thing we are going to need to do is specify a URI that we can give to SQL Alchemy so it can connect to it. So I'm going to go here in our Flask env. Now I'm going to the Flask env because working with the .env might bring some issues on Windows. So I want to keep things in here, but be sure to change your database URI to a file you don't commit to Git. So over here I'm going to have export SQL, and then I'm going to set that one to a local SQLite path, and then we'll put 3 slashes, and then we are going to have one called bookmarks.db. So once we define this, then we can go in our app. So we're going to go to our create, then we are going to go to our factory function. So here where we define the app config from, then we can go ahead and specify the SQL Alchemy URI. Then we're going to set that one to os.environ.get this. So we named ours as SQL Alchemy DB URI. So that's the one we want to make sure we have here. So one thing I've noticed is we named our columns using a small letter. Now this should be a capital letter, not a small letter. So let's go ahead and fix that before we go any further. So I'm going to select every occurrence. Then I'm going to make sure that this is a capital C. And now the last thing we're going to need to do is register our DB with our app. So we are going to import our DB. So from src with database import DB. So down here, before we register our blueprints, then we can go ahead and run db.app equals app, and then we want to do db.init_app, then we specify our app, just like this. And now, once we're done with this, we can go ahead and set up our tables or set up our database to start working or accepting connections. Here, I'm going to go back to the Flask shell, so I'll do Flask shell, And in here we can import our DB, so we can do from src.database import DB. So with DB, now we can call create all, and when we do that and we do a DB again, you can see that now this has created a path inside our REST API source folder, and it's called bookmarks.db. So this is how you create tables, by running create all. Now if you ever wanted to destroy all your tables, you can just do that by doing db dot drop all, like this. But we want to create them, so we will run create all and make sure that things are good. And now when we come back to our folder structure, you can see that over here we have a bookmarks.db. So if you have a SQLite Explorer, you can go ahead and you see our columns. But now this is where it is, and this is where it's going to live for now. So that is going to do it for this video. So in the next video, we're going to start working with like registering the user and also to log in users and all that fun stuff. So thanks guys for watching. If this one helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next video. Hey guys, welcome back. So in this one, we're going to be talking about HTTP status codes and how we can set them up on our application. Now, first, to understand what HTTP status codes are, it's basically a standard way for servers to communicate to the client of what happened on the server. Now, as much as we can be able to, on the server, let's say send back a message like, yeah, something was created on the server, or hey, something was deleted. That is something that we humans can understand, but clients and servers communicate to each other by looking at which status codes the server returned. So for example, here I'm on Instagram.com and I've filtered all my requests to only return the XHR requests. So you can see here that the status for all these requests was 200, meaning that things were fine. Now we need to be able to tell which one to send back to the client depending on what exactly happened. So when I sign out, you can see that now we have some other status codes here. And this was, of course, issued on the Facebook server back to this client, so this client can know what to do. So this is the Twitter login page. Notice that when I enter a username that like doesn't exist and I click next, they go ahead and send us a 400. Now, understanding this status codes proper is very important, just so we can understand what clients would expect and how they would interpret these errors. So you see that it's in red, and there's a reason for that. It's not because the developer coded it, it's because the Chrome client is built to interpret that as an error. So what I'm going to do is in our application, so I'm going to go here in our app. So I'll just go to constants. So in constants, remember we set up this file here, and then I'm going to bring in these status codes here. So you can see that they all start with HTTP and then the code. Now these codes are the ones that the browser will interpret, and they are the ones that we are setting to the values here. So in our applications, we are going to be using the status codes, this as a constant, and then it's going to be picking this by default. So these are the most common ones. Now you can differentiate when to use this or when to send this by looking at what you're doing. Now on a server, if something we want to send back to the client is something informational, so you will want to use some of the status codes that start with 1. If we want to notify that something was successful, we want to use ones that start with 2. For example, here you can see that if it's just a mere okay, we just send a 200. If something was saved, we use a 201. So if there's nothing to send back to the client, we send a 204, and the client will perceive these as successes. So if you take a look at the redirect one, the ones that start with the 300, so 300, so 301, 302, and the like, those ones will represent that there was a redirect on the server. It might be permanent, so be sure to take a look at the difference with the naming here. So we also have the client. So if the user, if there's like a validation error on the client, we would be using like a 400. If there's an issue on the server, let's say a server can't handle the load, we would be like sending back a 500. So that's our introduction to status codes. Now in the next one, we're going to start registering a user. So when a user has errors, we will come in here and we check if we want to send them like bad request. Or if we're able to save the user on the server, that one means that the resource was created, then we're going to be using like this. So by the end of the series, we will possibly have worked with most of these. So that's going to do it for now. If this one helped you, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Hey guys, welcome back. So last time we were able to set up our status codes, and now we know where we're going to be picking the status codes. So in this one, we're going to go ahead and start registering a user. If we go to our auth.py, you see we have an endpoint to handle the user registration. So if we went to our postman and then created a new request and then created a new request, so our new request will be a post request since our endpoint accepts a post, and we are going to be going to /api/v1/auth/register and did a post request. We are not sending anything, but we get user created here. But this is not real. This is not working with the DB. This is not working. This is not checking the user's data. So what you're going to be doing is sending things like username, email, passwords. So when we get this in our handler, we should be able to create an encrypted password. We should be able to validate that the email is valid, that the email is not taken, the username is alphanumeric, and all that fun stuff. So let's start here. Now I'm going to close down this because my screen is actually small. So we're going to start by importing a few things. So we'll get from, what is this one called? So from worksac, we do .security, import check password hash, generate password hash. So generate password hash and check password hash are going to be used to encrypt the user's password when we save it in a DB, just so people don't actually go in the DB and they see people's login credentials. So now over here, what we can do is we can try to get the data that the user is sending. So we need the username, the email, and also the password. So to get what is sent in a post request, we need to also import requests from Flask. So with the request, we should be able to do JSON. And then here we can define the key that we expect the username to be sent in. So expect this one to come in username. Let's do the same thing for the email and then the password. So email and then the password. So we're going to do some simple validations. So we're going to check if the length of the password is less than 6. So it can be, if it's less than 6, then we want to send back an error. So to send back an error, we're going to be using JSONify. So let's get JSONify here. So send back JSON, we're going to be using JSONify. So let's get that. So here we can just return JSONify, and we can just say password is too short. Okay. Now, like we said, we always want to send back a meaningful status code. Now over here, now this will be an error that can be solved by the user. So we can send a bad request here. So you can just do HTTP 400 bad request, and that's going to import our status code right here. Now that we have this check, we can do a simple check for the username and also for the username and also for the password. So for the username, we're going to check that it's alphanumeric. Let's first have a simple check to make sure that they're actually entering a valid name. So we just check the length. So we just check the length of the username. And let's have all our names be at least 3 characters and above. So we can just have username is too short. And be sure to change these messages if you have some better messages to use. So now let's check that the username is alphanumeric. Now we can check if a string is alphanumeric by calling .isAlnum. So we're gonna check if it's alnum. So we're gonna check if it's not alphanumeric. Also, we're gonna check if it has a space in there. So we can just do if space in username. Then you can tell them username should be alphanumeric. Also, you can just tell them also no spaces. And also, now that we've validated the username and also the password, let's also go ahead and validate that the email they are giving us is a valid email. Now we could validate it using a regex, but I'm just going to save ourselves time by installing a package called validators. So I'm going to do pip install validators. So as that installs, then we can come over here and import validators. So if you have validators, then we can check that we can use that to validate emails and say if not validators.email, then we can pass the email that we want to validate. So if the user's email is not valid, then we want to send them a JSON response and tell them that, hey, your email is not valid. So we're also going to check that if the email is valid, it doesn't exist already in our DB, since our restriction says that our email should be unique. So we can check that by doing if So we're going to import our model actually, because we're going to need to query the DB. So from source.database import user. All right. So here we can just do a query by doing if user.objects. Then we want to do filter by. So filter by. Then we want to check if the email equals this email. Then let's just do dot first. Then we want to check if it's not none. So if it's not none, that means that we have at least one record that matches. Then we can tell the user that this one already exists. So we can return JSON. Then we say email is taken. We're going to do the same check for the usernames because the username should also be unique. Now take note of the status code that we can use here. So if you go back to our status codes right here in the 400 level, notice that we also have one for the conflict. This means that a similar resource already exists on our server. So what we can do here is we can use that instead. So we can just do HTTP 409. Okay, so let's do the same check for the username. I'm gonna come back over here and just do the same check for the username. So we're gonna check for username, and if it exists, we tell them, hey, it's taken, and we send them a conflict response. So now that we have these checks in place, now we can go ahead and hash the user's password. So we can have pwd hash. So this is gonna be generate password hash, and then we just pass the password we want to hash. So the one you're going to hash, of course, is the user's password. So let's pass password in there. Now, once we have the password hash, then we can try to save this new user to our DB. So we can say user equals user. So when we instantiate it, we need to pass it. The values that are going to save in our columns. So username is going to be the username. The password is going to be the hashed version of the user's password. So pwd hash. Then the email is going to be the user's email. So once we instantiate our class, then we want to add it to the DB. So here, let's import user and also let's import DB. So down here, then we can say db.session.add. Then we want to add user. Also, we want to do db.session. Want to call commit, just so our changes can be saved. Now, once we update our DB, then we can tell the client, or now we can tell back the client that we were able to save this user on our DB, and maybe they can go ahead and log in. So we can just return. Of course, we're going to return JSONify, and in here we can just have like a simple message. So message. So for the message, you can say user created. Now we can also go ahead and send back the user. So user, we send back the username. The username is going to be the username they gave us. Also, let's send back the email. And the reason why we're sending back this extra information is the client might need to maybe welcome the user by saying, welcome, thanks for creating an account. So they can use this username that we confirmed on our server to just send a message like that. Then the last thing we're going to need to send here is the status code. And whenever we create a resource on our server, we want to send back a 201. So we can do HTTP 201 created. So now, if we run back our server, so I'm going to do Flask run. Notice how we get this warning here about SQL Alchemy. Now I'm going to suppress it here, just like they are suggesting. I'm going to suppress it by going to our init, and here where we configure our app, we can pass the SQL Alchemy URI, and also this. So I'm going to set that one to not. I'm going to set that to false, just so it stops yelling to us. So once we save that, you can see that it restarts, no warnings. And now if you go back to our Postman, so I'm going to go to Postman. This is the request endpoint. Then I'm going to select JSON here. Now when we select JSON, then we can be able to send our keys and values. So we can just do like username. So for the username, I'm just going to say username. Let's set the password. So the password can be password. Then let's also add an email. So we can do email. Serve email at app.com. And now, if we made this request, so if I click send, oh, notice that we get an error. And the reason why we are getting this error is because we are doing .objects. So this should be .query. So let's change that one to /query. to .query. So now if we try to do the same request, notice that we get our user created and we get a 201. So now if we try to create the same user, you see we get the error, email is taken. So if we change the email, I'm going to add another P and try again. You see that we match the username is taken. So I'm going to change the username, but I'm going to make the password short. So if we try to do this, you see that the password is too short and we can't use that. So let's just make sure our password is good. So for the username, I'm going to leave some spaces and also add some exclamation marks. We try this. You see that our validation for the username is also working good. Now, if we leave only a space, let's do that. You can see that it is still being handled properly. So if we run this, you can see that we get another user being created, and yeah. So that's going to do it for now. That is how we register a user. Now in the next one, we're going to be talking about how to use JWT authentication, how that whole token authentication thing works, and how to set it up with our app, and how to log in a user. So thanks guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next one. In this one, we are going to go ahead and set up JWT authentication and also log in our users and give them access tokens and refresh tokens. Now, if you're new to token authentication, so when you are making a REST API like we are doing here, it is intended to be consumed by different types of clients. So we can have an app that maybe is a Chrome extension, an Android app, an iOS app, a front-end app like a React app. So authenticating across all those different types of clients calls for a solution that is not session-based. Because by default, we can use sessions to track which user is logged in, when they log out, on what they can access, but that would not work if we are going to have a mobile app. So the approach that we take in that scenario is to implement token-based authentication, where whenever a user has a correct login on our server, we give them a token that they can use to make calls so that we can identify which user it is depending on the token that is being sent to us. Now previously, the way we would implement this is we would create a token stable where we have a user and their tokens, but most recently we have a new standard called JWT. Now JWT allows us to create these tokens without having to maintain a database table for these tokens and their users. Now JWT does this by using encryption techniques that base on a secret key. So with a secret key, we can be able to encode users' information into a token, and then when that token comes back, we can decrypt it using a secret key, and then we can tell which user it is without having to make a call to a database. So to implement this, we have different libraries that implement this. We can go ahead and implement it from scratch using the PyJWT module, which is an official way to interact with JWT from Python. But that will call for a lot of work. So that means we have to do almost everything ourselves. So some packages have been developed in response to making this process really easy. And the one we are going to be using is Flask JWT Extended. So this allows us to almost do all the use cases we might have, like working with refresh tokens, revoking tokens. So we're going to be installing this. So I'm going to go to the installation, and we are going to need to do pip install Flask JWT Extended. So I'm going to go to our terminal, then I will stop the server and run pip install this. So to set it up, we're going to go to our app because we're going to set it up with our app. Then we're going to go to JWT Extended. Then we want to import JWT Manager. So once we have the JWT Manager, then the next thing we're going to need to do is come and set it up with our app. So over here, we can just do JWT Manager and then set it up with our app, such that when we return it, it knows that JWT was configured now. One thing I mentioned before was that JWT authentication bases on a secret key to encrypt and decrypt tokens. So we're going to need a way to tell it about our secret key. I'm going to go to our flaskenv file. So flaskenv. So here we're going to have export JWT secret key. So I'm going to set it to secret key. And like I said, for very crucial information like this, we want to put them in a .env. But right now I'm putting them here just so people on Windows don't get the same issues. But if you can put them in .env, be sure to source source.env in your terminal just so it gets updated and picks it up. But for now, this should work fine. So once we have this in our init, we also need to pass it. So down here we can pass JWT secret key. and we'll set it to os environ get. So we'll be getting generate secret key like this. So the value here can be really anything, but you want to make sure it is very secured. So make sure it doesn't really leak to version control, and it should only be known to your server. So once we have that, now we can go ahead and start to work with logging in a user. I'm gonna go down here and we create another route to log in a user. So we're gonna have app.post. So app.post will detect when a user is going to /login. So when a user goes to /login, we are going to have a function to handle that. So we'll have login. To log in a user, we're going to first get the email and then the password that they are sending us. Now we can do that by doing email. It's gonna be request JSON email. Let's also get the password. So we can just do password. So one thing I want to do here is instead of us doing this, so instead of us using this syntax here, we're just gonna use a get. So get allows us to specify a fallback value if the user didn't actually send the email. But in our case, since these are the keys, so these are the keys that our frontend should send, and this usually is handled by developers, we can still rely that these are always going to be there. So here, let's make sure. So here, let's make sure we have a default value, just so our application doesn't crash. So the first thing we're going to check is if the user with this email exists in our DB. So we're going to have user equals user dot query. Then we want to filter by email. Then we want to do email equals email. Then we want to do dot first. So you can check if we have this user. Now we can check their password. So we can just have like is pass correct. So for the password, remember the password we have in a DB is encrypted, but the one the user is giving us is in plain text. So for us to be able to match those two, we are going to use this function here we imported called check password hash. So down here we can just do check password hash. So check password hash takes in the hash. So the hash is going to be the user's password from DB. So that is going to be user with password, because in a DB it is a hash, and we are going to be checking it against the password, which is now in this case is this password that the user is giving now. So now we can check if this password is correct. So we can do if is password correct, then that means that the user's authentication, that the user's login was good. So we can create for them an access token and also a refresh token. Let me go here and import some utilities. So I'm going to do from Flask JWT extended import create access token and also create refresh token. Now I'm going to be talking more about the details of this as we go. But right now what we want to do is here, once the password is correct, we can just have like refresh equals create refresh token. So refresh token takes in an identity. So once we specify identity, you can think of the identity as the user. So in this case, we can just pass like the user ID. So we can just pass user.id. Let's also create the access token. So access, the identity can still be the user ID. So once we have this, we can now tell the client that, hey, everything went well on the server, the user is who he claims to be, and you can go ahead and maybe redirect them to the home page and show them their stuff. So here we can just return JSONify. So in here, we're going to be sending back the user, but now we are also going to be sending the tokens in the user object. So we can pass the refresh and also the access. Let's also send the names, so username. This is going to be user.username, and also the email, which is going to be user.email. All right. So now, if we didn't match any user with this email, or if the password was wrong, then we are just going to be returning wrong credentials. So over here, we will be returning JSONify wrong credentials. I'm just going to have an error here, and then we can say wrong credentials. And then for the status code, we're just going to say unauthorized. So we didn't authorize the user. That's going to be 401. It's going to be HTTP 401 unauthorized. Okay, so once we have this, now we can go ahead and test it out we did things correctly, possibly things should be working. So let's run Flask run again. So the server is back. So we have an issue here. Oh, we used app dots. This should be off, not app. Okay. Let's rerun back the server. So we are back. Now if we go back to Postman, which is our testing client, I'm going to keep this one here, but I'm going to create another request. So this time we're going to be going to /login, and if we try to do a GET request, you said this is not being handled, but we want to make a POST request. We want to make sure that we are sending JSON. So I'm going to select JSON on here, and then inside here we want an email and then a password. So I'm going to use email at app.com. Then for the password, I'm going to use a password here. So if I try to send this, notice that we get wrong credentials, but if we use this user that we created here, so I'm going to use this username one, I'm going to use this email here that we have, and also the password. So for the email, it's going to be this. The password, so for the email, it's going to be this. The password is going to keep password because that's what it is, even here. So now, if we try to log in, to send, and yeah, we have our tokens, and we can go ahead and authenticate the user, and with these tokens, they can be able to access any other part of our application that needs them to be logged in. So if I come here, where we are sending these tokens, so it actually derived the status code here, but it's good we always specify our status codes, just so it doesn't mess it up at any time. So yeah, that's how we register a user. That's how we give them a refresh token and an access token. So in the next video, we're going to be talking more about refresh tokens and how to refresh access tokens. So thanks guys for watching. If this one helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you next time. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at how we can protect specific endpoints to limit them to only people who have tokens. For example, you see we have this /me endpoint, and in this /me endpoint, we should be able to send back the current logged in user's information depending on the token that they use. By the way, one thing I noticed up front is create access token might not be something we use down here. So yeah, this should have been create access token. So just a mistake I just saw. So let's continue. So from Flask JWT extended, we also have a decorator called JWT required. So you're going to import JWT required, and whenever you want an endpoint to require a user to first authenticate, so we're going to do at JWT required, and then that's going to make sure that, if a user tries to come here, we are going to tell them, hey, you're not using a token, so please first get a token. For example, now if I went to the browser and went ahead to /API v1me, notice how we get missing authorization header. So without this, a user would still be able to access the route. So if I come back, you can see that it works. But with this, a user will have to first authenticate. So let me bring up my Postman again. And for us to authenticate, I'm going to create another request. Let's say like here. And this one, of course, is going to be going to me. So to add a header, if we go to our login, so here in our login, if we try to make the same request, we get the access token. This is what we want to send on all the requests that need authentication. So here, I can come to auth and go to bearer token. So the type we use here is bearer token, and I'll show you more in the documentation. And now if we make this request, notice that now we are able to access the route. So if this token is malformed or it has been tampered with, you should be able to see that the token was not correct. So yeah, so for us to be able to get the real user, so inside here, we can use something called get JWT identity. We are going to import something called get JWT identity. So down here, I'm going to import PDB here. So PDB is the Python debugger. It enables us to pause a program, and then we can inspect some variables and functions. So I'm going to pause that, and then when I come here and try to make the same request, you see that it gets paused here. But when we do get JWT identity and call it, you see that it gives us the user ID that was encoded using that token. So we could go over here and do, let's say, user equals get JWT identity. So that's going to give us the user ID. So in fact, I'm just going to call it user ID. Then we can go ahead and now query our DB to get which user this one is. So we can do user.query. We want to say filter by ID, and when we're going to filter where the ID is the user ID, and then let's call first because that should give us only one. So we can set this one to the user. Now we can just return Justify. We can just have like the username, which should be user.username, and also the email, which should be user.email. Yeah, that's it. If we go back to Postman and make the same GET request, notice that we get the user sent back to us. So let's make sure we are sending the status code, and things should be good. So that's how you get the current login user. If you had like a profile model that had like more information, you would get them here. And also something I should mention probably is the application we're working with here is pretty simple. But if you had like large amounts of data, you literally might not want to be doing like user.name. You might just want to serialize user at glance without having to get the attributes. So you would be doing that by looking at something like Marshmallow or other ways, or creating specific serialization classes that can do that work for you. But for now, this should be okay. We should be able to still do fine. So thanks guys for watching. In the next one, we are going to be looking at how to create refresh tokens. If this video was helpful, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next one. Hey guys, welcome back. So in this one, we're going to go ahead and see how to refresh a token. Like you saw, whenever we log in a user, we give them two tokens, the access and the refresh. Now, the access, we've already seen how it can be used. We can use it to access protected endpoints like this /me. Since the access token grants access to the resources on our server, we always want to make it short-lived, so that in any case that someone gets access to it, they still wouldn't use it to access resources on our server for a long time. So just something to mention here, you see how we have all these configurations here. Now the one we set was only the secret key, but if you wanted to set anything else, like any other config to the module, be sure to check one of these. So for example, you can see access tokens by default will take 15 minutes to expire, but we could change that if we wanted to. And the recommendation is to always make it as less than this as possible. And then you can see that the refresh tokens can be like 30. So we can always use this to refresh the access tokens. So to now create an endpoint to refresh the access tokens, I'm going to go to our code. So over here, we will have another endpoint. It's going to be /auth, then dot. We can have a post. So I'm going to have a post here. Now here, we want to go to when a user goes to /token /refresh. So let's create a function to handle that. So refresh token, user token. One thing here, we want the user to only access this endpoint by giving us a refresh token. Now for us to enforce that what they give us here is a refresh token, we are also going to use at JWT required, this decorator here on this very view. But the difference here is here we are going to expect them to give us a refresh. We are going to expect them to give us a refresh token. So we're going to pass refresh equals true. So to handle this, what we want is to first get who the user is. So we can do identity. Then when we do get JWT identity, it should give us the user ID. So now we can create a new access token. So we can just say access token. Should we create access token? And in this case, we pass the identity, which should be our identity. And now that we have a new access token, then we can return to the user. So we can just say return justify. Then let's have the access token for the user. Then it's going to be the new one that we just generated for them. And I will send back a 200, so HTTP 200, okay. If we come back to our postman, so if we do a post, remember we need to send the refresh token. So you can see that it goes ahead to validate that we are not sending it. So in auth, we can choose we want to use bearer token, and we can, if we try to use this, notice that it fails. This one is expired, so we need to be using a refresh token that is valid. So I'm going to log in here, and that's going to give us a new refresh token. And now we can use this, and on this endpoint, we can go ahead and use that. And now when we click send, you can see we get a new access token. And this new access token is associated with the very same user who logged in here. So that is how we refresh the tokens. So if you wanted to use a different method for this, It's just up to you. You can just do a get. It doesn't really matter since we are not even posting anything. So that's how we refresh the user's token. So I'm going to be pausing the video here. If it helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. In the next video, we are going to start working with the bookmarks, creating bookmarks and retrieving bookmarks and all that fun stuff. So one thing I want to show you guys is another way that we can define an endpoint. So you see how we've been doing bookmarks.get, bookmarks.post. If we wanted to have an endpoint that handles two HTTP methods, we basically would do bookmarks.get or .post like that, and then we'd have a function that can handle any of these. But you will see a lot of source code that will be defined differently like this. So you would see bookmarks.route somewhere. This was the standard way to define a route in the previous versions of Flask. If we wanted to define an endpoint that accepts both a get and a post method, we would be doing it like this. So as a second argument, we can specify methods, and that can be a list where we can specify the methods that this route will handle. So in this case, we want to use the same endpoint to post or create a link or a bookmark. Also, we're going to use one to get all of them. Now here we can have a function to handle that, bookmarks. So in here, if we wanted to check which request method the user used, we can go here and import request from Flask 2. So down, then we can check the request method by checking if request dot method. Then we can check if it's get or post. So if it's post, that means that the user is going to be trying to create a new link on the server. So what we can do is we can now get the body. So body, we can set that one to request dot get JSON. By the way, you can do .json or you can do .get JSON. And then with this, you can do a .get, and we want to get the body. So let's also have a fallback, just so because the body can be nullable. So let's also get the URL. So the URL, of course, we're going to get it as URL. We need to check if this URL is valid, because that's a very crucial part of our application. For everything to work, the redirects, the URL has to be valid. So let's import validators. So import validators. Now when we have validators, we can check if the URL is valid. So let's check if not, validators.url, and let's pass our URL. So if it's not a valid URL, then we want to return an error, so we can return. And then for the value, we can say enter a valid URL like this. So let's go ahead and also send the status code. So this one is going to be a 400. If the URL is valid, we're going to check that this doesn't exist in the database again, because we don't have repeated URLs. So we can just do a simple check. So we can do if. So let's import bookmark. So from src.bookmarks bookmark. So now over here we can check if bookmark.query. Then we want to run filter by. So we'll filter by URL equals URL. So if this exists, so let's do first. So if this exists, then we want to tell the user that this already exists. So we can just come over here and we return a URL already exists. And this is going to be a conflict. So we can do HTTP 409. And yeah, that's how we handle that. So if the URL is valid and it doesn't exist, then we need to go ahead and we create a new bookmark and save it to our database. So here I'm going to do bookmark. So bookmark is going to be bookmark. So we instantiate our model class and then we give it all the properties. So we need to set the URL. It's going to be our URL. Then we need to set the body. It's going to be our body. Then the next thing we're going to need to set is the user ID. So for the user ID, this is going to be the current logged in user. So user ID is going to be the current logged in user. So here I'm going to do current user. So to get the current user, you know, we have something called get JWT identity. Just go ahead and import that from Flask JWT extended. So get JWT identity. So to get the current user, I'm going to define here, we can do get JWT identity, and that gives us the ID. And as we are still here, let's go ahead and we protect this endpoint. So we make it accessible to only users that are logged in. So here we can put JWT required. All right, and that should go ahead and we need to import it, which is there. So here we have the current user as the ID. Now what we want is we want to import the DB. So import bookmark. Let's also get DB. But we need to commit our changes. So db.session.add bookmark. So let's also do db session commit, just so changes can be persisted. Okay, so after we save to the db, then we can return to the user, and this time we want to JSONify, and we want to be sending the newly created object. So since our properties are not really so many, we can now send back the ID. So whenever we create, we get an ID associated with this bookmark. So we can just do that from document.id, from bookmark.id. Then let's also go ahead and send back the URL, then the short URL. So the URL, we can just use bookmark URL. Then the short URL, that should be like the shortcode. So short URL, this is gonna be bookmark. On the model, we called it short URL, so we can do that. Then the next thing we're gonna need to get is the number of visits. So for the visits, obviously we expect them to be 0 because by default we set it to be 0. But let's get that one. Then let's also get the body, bookmark.body. Let's get created at. Let's get updated at. So updated at, like this. Our status code, this is a creation. We can send a 201, so HTTP 201 created. Now before we test it out, I want to create the one to get all. So down here, remember our route can handle 2 HTTP methods. Now since we want to handle the get all, so you can have an else, and for an else, and if it's not a post request, you're going to be sending back all the bookmarks that this user had created. So to get all the bookmarks created by this user, we are going to first make a query for it. So we're going to do bookmarks. It's going to be bookmark.query.filter by. We are going to filter by the current logged in user. So we can do user underscore ID. It's going to be equal to current user. So that's going to give us a bunch of bookmark options. Now, when we have bookmark options, we need a way to serialize those Python objects into some data we can send over a network. By default, we can't really send the bookmarks. So what we're going to do is here we are going to create our own Python list, and then for each of the bookmarks, we're going to be adding them to our data. Then we're going to be returning that. So here I'm going to do a for item in bookmarks. So for each of those, we're going to be adding it to the data list. So we're going to do data.append. So we're going to be appending a new object, and it's going to look like this. So instead of using item, we can use bookmark in bookmarks. And for each of these, we're going to be adding them to our data list. And then that's what we want to return, because that is a Python list, and we can return it using JSONify. So here we can do return JSONify. You can have a key as data, and then the value as data, and then the status code should be a 200. So we can do HTTP 200. Okay. So once we have this, everything is up and running. We can test it out. And later I'm going to be showing you how to use pagination, like to paginate, just so we don't get everything at once. So now that we have this, we can go back to our Postman. So inside Postman, I'm going to log in here just so we have a new. And the reason why we are getting this error is, you see, when we come to how we defined our function, we called it bookmarks. And this function is conflicting with the name that we gave to our blueprints. So what we want is, we want to change this to something else. I'm going to call it handle bookmarks. And then we also need to change a directory required. We need to instantiate it like this. So once we do that and we try to log in here, so when I log in, you can see that now we get our access token. So I'm going to copy the access token, and I'm going to get another URL. So for this URL, we're going to go to v1 bookmarks So if we try to make a request to this, it's going to say we need to authenticate. So I'm going to go to my auth and then choose JWT, choose bearer, then use my token here. So when I send a request, note that we get an empty list sent back to the user, but we get a 200. Now, if we want to post to this, or if we want to create one, we're going to go to our body. So I'm going to select row here, and then I will choose JSON. So we need to send a URL. So for the URL, so we need to send a URL. So for the URL, I'm going to have a Google URL in there. So just have a google.com. So let's also have a body. So for the body, this should be double quotes for it to be valid JSON. Let's say my site. So let me change it to /images just so I can show you something. So if we try to post this, you notice that we get an error, and the error we get basically is because we are not putting the slash. So we need to put a slash just so it can be handled properly by our route. So if we put a slash there and submit, you can see that we get our URL being saved, and also we get a shortcode being assigned to this. And later we're going to be seeing how we can work with this shortcode to be able to track how many visits we did to this URL. So now if we go back, if we do a get again, so if we do a get request, you can see that now in our responses, we get our URLs being sent back to us. If we made a third one, let's say this one now goes to bing.com. So let's post this, my Bing site. Let's send. You can see it gets created. Now if we do a get request, we can see that now we get 3 items being sent to us. So that's how we do a basic create and read on our bookmarks table. So if the video helped you out, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you in the next one. So now we are able to list all our bookmarks whenever we make a get request to /bookmarks. So in this one, we are going to go ahead and implement pagination on this list. Us being able to send 1,000 records at once over a network will be costly in terms of the user's data. So what we want is to be able to allow the front end to request a specific number of items and also on a specific page. So what we're going to do here is let me just maximize this. So right now the way we are querying this is we are doing query by the current logged in user. But also what we want is we want to be able to paginate. Now to be able to paginate, we are going to need two things. One will be the page we want to get records from. Another one will be the per page count. I'm going to first get the page of the records we are trying to get from the front end. So we can get that one from args. So we're gonna do request.args. Then we want to do get page. So by default our page is gonna be 1. And then we are gonna type it to an int. So we're gonna be type equals int. So if the user doesn't send the page, we'll just default to sending them page 1. Okay? But if they send it, then that's going to be the page we query by. So now that we have the page, let's also get the per page, just so we know how to limit our query. So we can do per page. It's going to be request.args. Then let's get per page. So per page, the default is going to be 5. Then let's also type it as an int. So now that we have this, on the query we made, we can go and do paginate. So we can do paginate. So paginate takes in two things. One will be the page. So we can do page equals the page, and also the per page. So per page, we already have that. Let's do per page. So that's gonna keep working the same, but now we also want to be telling the front end that, hey, there are some other pages that you might want to check out. So down here, I'm going to have a property called meta. So I'm gonna set it to a dictionary. Now, one of the things that we're gonna be sending back to the front end is the current page. So we can just send the page. So to get the current page, we can get that from the bookmarks. So we can do bookmarks. That's gonna be page. Then the next thing we're gonna need to send is the number of pages that are there. We can also send like the total number of items. So that's going to give us like all of them. Then something else that we might work with is the previous number. So if you are like on page 2, the previous number would be 1. So that is obvious to get even when you're on the front end, but let's go ahead and send it for the user. So to get prev number, so to get the previous one, we just do prev num. So for the next, we can also send back the next page by doing next. I'm going to call it next page actually. Also, this can be prev page. So we also have some other properties like has next or has previous, which I think we can also send just so we can look at how they work. So has next. So in the bookmarks we have has next. We also have has prev. So has prev, that's what we want to check here. So let's go ahead and save this now. Now that we have the meta, we can go ahead and when we send back our data, we can go ahead and send back the meta. So here we can send meta. So now if we go back to our Postman and we try to get this, you can see that our token has expired. So let's go ahead and create a new and log in again. In a real app, you would have a strategy to automatically refresh it just so we don't ever get that token expired message. So now let's go over here. Let's go over here and change back the token to use a valid one and make a request. You can start to get this error that pagination object is not iterable. And the reason why we are getting that error is whenever we paginate, so whenever we paginate on our query, we get more things sent back to us. Now the data itself or the bookmarks themselves, they are sent back to us in a key called items. So and then these other things, so these other things like has prev, pages, page, those ones are also in those specific keys. But the data is in bookmarks.items. So that's what we want to now loop through. So I'm gonna come here and now make the same request. And now you can see that we get data being sent to us. So down here you can see that we have a new meta property and it has all these details for us. Now I'm gonna go here and actually create more just so we can test out the pagination. So just allow me to quickly change this and just have some more URLs to work with. Okay, so now we have more than 2 pages. So if you do a GET request again, you should be able to see that we get only 5 sent back to us, and we can see that has next is true, has previous is false, and we are still on page 1. But if we wanted to request page 2, so to request page 2, you can see here in our code, we said that we can send the page. So we can send it as an argument. So in Postman, we can do a query and we send page equals, let's say 2. So when we say page equals 2, notice that now we are sent all the details that are on page 2, and you can see that now we have some previous that we skipped, some previous items that we skipped. So if we requested page 3, notice that we have only 11 items, so page 3 should only contain only 1 item. So if you go to page 3, you should be able to see that now we only have 1 item sent back to us. And if we wanted to adjust how many we request, we can just come and add and put an ampersand, then we say per page. So per page, let's say we want all of them. But now that means page 3 won't have any. So if we do that, you can see we get this 404. So if we request page 1, we should be able to get all of them sent at once. So those are the basics of how to paginate. Now, thanks guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next one. So now that we are done retrieving and paginating our bookmarks, let's go ahead and create a page which can retrieve a single item. So to create that page, we're going to keep in our bookmarks blueprint. So over here, we're going to have at bookmarks. Then we want to do .get. So to get one, we're going to be getting it by the ID. So over here, we can have int the ID. This is going to be a dynamic ID part of the URL. So over here, let's have a function to handle that. So let's say get bookmark. When we have specific variables that we are passing through the request, we want to also accept them in the handler function. So inside here, now we can use this ID to find that item. But first we also need to make sure this endpoint is protected. So to make it protected, we're just gonna do JWT required. Here, let's define the current user. So that's gonna be get JWT identity. Now we want to ensure that the user who created this is the only one who can see it. So we're gonna make a query to a DB. So the DB query is gonna be bookmark.query.filter by. So we want to filter by user ID. It's going to be the current user, and then we also are going to try to find this bookmark by its ID. So we're going to do ID equals ID. And since it's going to be 1, we want to do first, just so we get that very one. So if we don't get the bookmark, so we can do if not bookmark. So that would mean that the one trying to request it is not that very user, is not the user who created it, so this didn't match, or they are giving us an ID that we actually don't have in a DB. So if we don't have it, so if not bookmark, then we can tell them that, hey, not found. So we can return JSONify, then we can say message, and let's do item not found. So for this, we can send back a 404. So we have an HTTP method for 404, not found. So 404, not found. That's the one we want to send back. But otherwise, if we have the bookmark, then we can go ahead and return it. So just like we did here, we're going to return something like this. So we will have return JSONify. So we'll be JSONifying this, the ID and all these other details. So then we send back a 200. So HTTP 200, okay, just like this. So now if we go back here and try to get on /bookmarks/1, notice that our token has expired. So let's go ahead and refresh it, or we get a new one. So let me just get this. Then I'm gonna go here. Then in the auth, then I'm gonna change that. Now you can see that we get that one, but if we try to get one that doesn't exist, like this one, we get a not found, and we get a 404 being sent. So that's how we retrieve one. So in the next section, we are going to see how we can delete or update. So thanks guys for watching. If this video helped you, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you soon. So now let's go ahead and add ability to edit a bookmark that we've saved. So we should be able to change the details of the body or the URL itself. So to do that, it's actually going to look a lot like the add. So we're going to have a handler for that. So on here, we'll have at bookmarks. Then we want to call dots. We use two common HTTP methods. One is the put, another one is the patch. So we want to target when a user is going to put on the ID, is making a put on the ID. So we can also handle the same thing for the patch. So we can just have patch on there too. So then we can handle edits bookmark. So we also need to expect the ID to be sent. We're also going to need to first check if it exists, because we don't want to try to change something that doesn't exist. Let's make sure that the user is logged in. So we're just going to put a JWT required decorator. So over here, we can go ahead and verify that the bookmark exists already. So if it exists, then we're going to go ahead and we change it. So we are going to get the new body and the new URL that the user is sending to us. So if you go in our post, we are going to need to get these, and also we're going to validate the URL. So I'm going to copy this very thing. So down here, we can now get the body that the user is sending and the URL, and then we'll validate that the URL, the new URL is actually still valid. Now once the URL is valid, then we can go ahead and update it in the DB. So since we've already found the bookmark, it's here. To update it, we want to do bookmark.url. We'll set it to the new URL, and then the body is going to be bookmark.body. It's going to be the new body. Okay, then after we do this, then we want to call db.session.commit. Okay, that's going to make sure that our database syncs the change. So this is how we update. So to test this, I'm going to go to our postman, then I'm going to get one. So when we get one, now remember we need to make a put. So I'm going to make a put, but I'm going to change. So I'm going to change the URL from Google. So I'm going to change it from Google to sites.google, something like this. Then let me change the body to my Google site. So let's change this. So now if we do a put on this, you notice that we get an error that the function didn't return properly. So that's because when we finished committing the session, we didn't actually return a response. So we're going to be returning a response. So just the same way we returned when we created. So on creation, we returned this, and this is the same thing we want to return, except that we want to return a new, except that now the status will not be create, but it will just be okay. So we just return the sonify, then this is gonna be HTTP, okay. So if we try to change now again, you can see that we get a new one. So you see the ID is kept like it was before, but the URL is changed to a new one. And yeah, so that's how we update. If we made a patch, so patch is usually used when we want to update like bits of these objects, which I think should even be ideal for this kind of thing. It will still work because our handler handles both of them just like this. So yeah, that's how we update. So in the next one, we're gonna be seeing how to track which links we visited and the links we have not visited. So thanks guys for watching. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you later. Hey guys, welcome back. So let's go ahead and we'll see how we can delete an item. So by the end of the video, we should create an endpoint which should take an ID and then check if the user who's trying to delete it is the one who created it, and then it deletes it from the DB. So to do that, we are going to do something that's similar to the get. So I'm actually going to copy this over here. So down here, I'm just going to duplicate this, and now we are going to be doing a delete request. So we're going to do a delete, and then we expect the user to give us an ID. We want the user to be authenticated, so we'll just have this decorator. Then we're going to rename this to delete bookmark. So we'll check who the user is. Then we're going to first try to check if the user is the one who authored it or who owns it. So if they are not the ones, then we are going to tell them, hey, we didn't find that. So otherwise, we want to delete it. So now we can delete it using the DB. So we can do db.session.delete. So we're going to be deleting the bookmark. So we need to confirm that by doing db.session.commit. So now that we finished deleting, we need to send back a response. Now for the delete, we can send back a message like, hey, we deleted something. But a lot of the times you're gonna see that a lot of the times this is gonna be implemented by sending a no content status. So here we can just return for the content, we just leave it empty, but then we send back a no content. So we can do HTTP 204 no content like this. So now if we go here in our terminal and we make a delete request, so if we do a delete, you can see that it was deleted and we get a no content. If we try to fetch it again, you can see that it was not found. And if we make a get request to all of them, so now we expect all of them to be 10 and not 20. To all of them, down here we have 10. That means it was deleted from the DB. So thanks guys for watching. If this one helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you later. Last time we saw we can update one and also we are able to view one. So in this one, let's go ahead and we start implementing link tracking. Now the idea for link tracking is just so we can track how many times the user who created this bookmark clicked on it. Because the whole idea for the bookmarks is to be able to check them out later. Just so with this kind of feature, we can implement something like on the front end to allow the user to see which links they are least checked out, what the ones they've checked out more. So to be able to do that, the logic we are going to use is, notice how we have the short URL. So we have this, but with this, we know that we can map it to the URL. So we are going to have a route on our app that will be accepting something like this. So you see how we have /5000. We are also going to have / something like this. So with this, we can pick which. So with this, we can pick which URL it is, and then we increment its visits count. So the way we're going to do that, notice that this is not under any blueprint. So we can as well put it here in our app and we let it get handled by our app. So down here, we are going to have an app, then we want to do a get. So for this, we want when a user goes to the short URL. So I'm just going to call it short URL. But it's going to be a placeholder for whatever the user enters there. It could be something like this. It could be any other of those 3 characters. So let's have a function to handle that. So I'm going to call this one redirect to URI. And of course, we need to accept the short URI in there. And what it's going to be doing is going to be finding the bookmark, and then increasing its visits count. So let's import bookmarks on here. So from database, import that. Let's also import bookmark because we're going to need to query the DB. So on here we can just say bookmark. It's going to be bookmark dot query. Then we want to run filter by. So filter by. So we'll filter by short URL, and then we're going to check the one that is equal to this short URL. Now with this we can be able to call fast or 404. So in the previous videos we saw we were doing fast, but here we can do fast or 404, which always comes in handy if you want to throw an error. So fast or 404, so that's going to be able to throw a 404 error if we didn't find this. Remember, we need to handle a redirection. We don't need to send back a JSON like it wasn't found. So it's ideal to just throw an error just so a user knows that, hey, what I'm doing isn't working. So now that we have the bookmark, we can check if we have it. So we just do if we have the bookmark, then we can do bookmark.visits. So we're going to be increasing them. So we're going to be setting them to bookmark.visits. Then we're going to add one on them. So once we do that, then we need to, of course, update by doing a session commit. So db.session.commit, just like this. Now after we update our database, then we can go ahead and return a redirect. So instead of us returning the response here, we can return a redirect. So from Flask, we can also import a redirect. So now here we can just return redirect, and we'll just redirect to the URL itself of this bookmark. So now we can just redirect to bookmark.url, and yeah, that should be able to work. This should be a placeholder and not the exact string. So over here we need to define it as a placeholder like this. So now if we did the same request, you can see that it goes to the app and it returns a redirect and it goes here. So now if we came and did a get request for this, I'm going to do a get, and the token is expired, but let me go ahead and get a new one. And we expect it to have updated the visits count, because in this case we have actually visited it. So I'm going to go here and change the token. So if we do a get, you can see that now the visits are 1. If we check it out again, so I'm going to go here. So if we check it out again, let me just take this one again and put it here, go. And you can see that now, if we do another get, you can see that we've checked it out 2 times. Yeah. Hey guys, welcome back. So now I want to show you how we can gracefully return JSON when we get errors like 404. So since this is a JSON only API, it makes sense to just send JSON instead of this HTML. So here in our app, itself, over here we can have an error handler. So we can have app, we want to call error handler. So when you call error handler, you need to give it the code of the error we want to handle, or an exception. So that means that if you had a very specific exception you want to be sending specific responses for, you would add it. But for us, we want to handle when a user gets an HTTP 404 not found, and we are not handling it in that view. So if this is the error that the app is running into, so just the same way we handle other routes, we can define a function to handle this. So we will call this handle 404. So we're just going to be returning a JSON response. So we're just going to return JSONify. And then we're just going to say, obviously this is going to be throwing a 404, but since we are sending just one JSON, we can as well explicitly define the type. So it's going to be a 404. So whenever we create the handler function, we also need to pass the exception. So I'm going to pass E here. So that can mean anything. Now, if we come back to our app, so I'm going to refresh here. I'm going to try to go to this endpoint here. So I'm going to refresh it. And now you can start to get JSON being sent back to the user. So if we remove this and we try to access this, you can see that we get HTML. So if it's if it's a JSON only API, then it makes sense to do something like this. So we can also handle errors that come from the server. So let's say the application is collapsing for some reason. So if we want to handle like 500 level errors, so here we can just handle server errors. So HTTP 500 internal server errors. Then we can handle those similarly by doing something went wrong. Please try again. We are working on it. Or something like that. But whenever we are doing something like this, the intent mostly is not to just tell the user this is happening. Of course, that is good. But we also would want to know that these errors are happening in our applications, and we can find a way of handling this. So the common case is to implement some error reporting or error logging. So when an error like this happens, we send it to like the admin of our app, and the admin can go ahead and check the logs and can come and fix the error that originated into this error being thrown. So if we come back here, so to test this, obviously we need to have an error in the application. So I'm going to go to the bookmarks and let me see how to create an error intentionally. So for example, on the slash route, I'm just going to come in and say print A. So we don't have A anywhere, so this should throw an application error. So if we go to API slash, it's going to be slash API slash bookmarks, which is this one. Notice, so slash API slash bookmarks. So right now it is handling, so right now this is catching it, but if we remove something like this and we come back here, make a call to the same endpoint. So notice how the 500 error is not being called by our handler function. And the reason why this is the case is because we are running into bug mode. But notice when I come here and show you, so notice when I come and change the Flask environment to production. So I'm going to go to our Flask env, and instead of us using development, I'm just going to change it to production just for now. Obviously, going to production, we need to change a lot of other things, but just to demonstrate the error, I'm going to stop that and run back the server. So the server is on, so we can still run this. So now if I refresh, you can see that we get something went wrong, and this is now handling the errors. So point to note here is our handler for the 500 will only work when we are running in production. So these kinds of errors don't get thrown to the user. Hey guys, welcome back. So now we have implemented link tracking. Now let's go ahead and provide an endpoint that can give us some statistics about how our links have been visited. So what we're going to do is here in our bookmarks, we're going to go down here and we're going to have at bookmarks, we want to have .get. So we want to get when a user goes to stats, and let's have a function. It's going to be get stats. So for this one, we basically are going to be returning a list, and that list is going to be containing a link and how many times it was visited. Now we're going to make a query that will give us all the links for the current logged in user. So we can do that by doing bookmark. Then we want to do query filter by. So here, let's protect the endpoint, make sure we have the user. So that means we can get the current logged in user just as normal by doing get JWT identity. So here we can just do bookmark, we can do user ID. The user ID should be the current user. So if we want all of them, we can do .all. Alright, and that's going to give us all of them. So now to get the links, we're just going to loop over them. And for each of them, so we're going to be getting the link stats from each of these items, and then we're going to be adding it to our main array. So if for each of the items, we're going to create a new link variable, and that's going to contain a dictionary. So it's going to have visits. So for the visits, we basically are going to be checking link.visits. Now for the link here is going to be item. So let's also get the URL. All right. Let's also send back the ID, just so we need to work with it somehow. We can also send back our short URL. So So now that we have this, we can just append it to our data. So we can do data.append. We're going to be appending there our new link, and then outside the loop, then we can just return JSONify. Then we can just do data here. Then we can save that one to data. Then we can just return 200. So HTTP 200. Okay. And save that. Let's remove this. And now, if we go to our Postman and try to go to /bookmarks/stats. In the real world, we need to refresh that without having to tell the user that it expired. So we need to refresh it automatically for the user. So now, if I try that, you can see that now we get all our links sent back to us and how many times they were visited. So that's how we implement the stats endpoint. So in the next one, I'm going to be showing you how to do some custom error handling on our API as we are getting close to winding up. Hey guys, welcome back. So now we have built all our endpoints. We have tested them out in Postman. Now what we are going to be doing is we are going to go ahead and add documentation for our API, because yes, we have built an API, we have built our backend code, but right now it's only us that understands which endpoints are on our server and how they can be accessed. So we need a way to tell other people about how our API is, what our API is, and how it is structured and how it should be accessed, what parameters, what URLs we can expect. And we are going to be doing that by describing it using Swagger. So Swagger is just a set of tools that can help us to describe and document our API in a standard way. And that means that anyone who understands the Open API spec or the Swagger spec can quickly read and understand what our API does. Now, I'm here on the Swagger IO specification. Now, I just scroll down to the things you need to do to describe your API. So we need a way to define like what our API is, who is it for. If you have some terms of use, we can list those ones there. So we'll have to create something like this. So we can also define like a contact object, which should also have these compulsory or optional fields like name, URL, and the email. So there's a license. We have the server object, so we can define like a base URL for our server. So yeah, if we have multiple servers, we would specify something like this. So I'm going to scroll down just so you can take a look at what else is available. So we also have the components objects. This is mostly the things you're going to be describing. So how responses should look, how requests should look, how the requests should look, how the headers should be, what query params should be there, those kinds of things. So all this stuff, we are going to need to create a document for all these kinds of things. Now you notice that it's quite a lot here. So to be able to make a documentation for a Flask app, we have different utilities that we can use. Now, depending on how you build your app, some of these tools can be able to automatically pick up a documentation. But the way we are building our app, we are basically following a simple structure. We are not using like serializers to handle our responses. So we're going to need to do some extra setup. Notice that when you're using Flask RESTful, your documentation might not look the same as you're going to work to implement ours. But later I'm going to be creating an API using Flask RESTful, which is like an abstraction layer and makes things more easy, and Marshmallow. These make things more easy to work with. So right now, for us to get started documenting our own, because either way, we need a way to tell the whole world what our API is and how it can be accessed. We are going to be installing this Flask, and we are going to be manually documenting our API. So first thing we're going to need to do is to install it. So I'm going to go to the installation block. So we need to install Flask like this. Setup tools, we already have it. So here, I'm going to stop the server. Then we can install Flask. Okay, they were so innovative on the name. So once we install Flask, we need to configure a few things. Now here in our config, I'm going to create a file called swagger.py. So I'm going to bring in this here, and then we can go over it. So with Flask, we need to define a template. Now you notice that these are the things we are seeing in the API spec. These are the things you are seeing here in the specification. So here we need to define a template where we can specify the info about our API. So this is going to be standard. You don't really have to memorize all this. You just need to know what they mean. So we're going to define a base path. So we don't want to be saying So we don't want to be our server API v1 on every call. So we can define a base path, and then all the URLs can be relative to this. So we also specify that we can accept HTTP or HTTPS. So this part here is really important. So for the security definitions, there we define that our API uses the bearer type of authentication, and whenever a user is making requests, the bearer authentication with the type of the API key. And then we specify that whenever a user is making a request, we need them to send us the authorization in a header. And the authorization, of course, is going to be the bearer type and should be the JWT token. Okay, so once we define this outside the template, down here, I'm going to bring in another config. So for this config, we basically define the initial headers. Now for the specs, the API that we generate here should be compatible with other documentation tools. So we specify a route that we can use to get a JSON version of our documentation, which we can move onto any other tool that understands OpenAPI or Swagger, and it should be able to work just fine. So then we define a static path. So this static path here is basically used to generate the CSS to show on our documentation. So don't mind much about that. So we also define that we want to be using Swagger UI. So basically Swagger UI just lets us visualize things in a good way. And we specify the default route, which is going to be at the home page. So from now, every time we go to the home page, we should expect to see a documentation. We need to configure this directly with our app, just so our app can now understand it. So what we need to do is in our Danda init. So for Danda init, you're going to go here and import a few things from Flask. So we can do from Flask import int. So we're gonna import Swagger itself. We're also gonna import swag from. So swag from enables us to create a YAML file where we can describe our spec. So once we import this, we need to go in our config. So over here, we can also pass a Swagger config. So Swagger, and then inside here, we can specify the title. So the title can be Bookmarks API. And then we're going to specify the UI version. So Swagger UIs have evolved. Now we can choose the one we want to use. I'm going to choose 3, which is the current at the moment. So I'll specify UI version like that. Let's go ahead and from our config import our Swagger config. So from source.config.swagger import, we need the template and also the other Swagger config we defined. So now down here, before we return the app, so I'm gonna go here. So right here, we can go ahead and configure Swagger. So we're gonna do Swagger, and then we give it the app. So our app is app. Then the next thing we're gonna give it is our config. So for the config, we'll just do config equals Swagger config, and then we can pass the template. So we can do template equals the template we defined in our config. So once we have this, our setup will be done. Now to start documenting, so we're going to start by documenting this short URL. Now to document this, what we want is to use the @swag from decorator. So we can do @swag from, and then we can specify the spec. So in our case, we will need to specify the path to where our YAML file definition will be. So here we are going to, so here in our I'm going to create a file called docs, and then inside docs I'm going to have each blueprint, and then inside we're going to be putting the documentation. So let me have auth here, and let's start with login.yaml. So let's also create the one for bookmarks. So I'm going to do bookmarks. Now there are some endpoints that are not really in our apps. For example, this one. So for this one, what you can do is just in the root, we can create a short URL .yaml. Since we are in the docs folder, should be able to work fine. And then inside here, we can first define what it does. So you can say redirects to. So now here, this is a YAML format. So be sure to make sure you're consistent. So we want to define the tags that this should have. Now the tags are useful if you want to group the URLs in the documentation, as you will see. So we can also specify parameters. So for the parameters, we can say, okay, for someone to come here, we want to first make sure that in the path we have the short URL, and then we can specify that this will be required. So we can do required true. With YAML, true is not like a Python true. We use the true like this. So also we can define like the responses, just so we can tell the people what they can expect. So we can do responses, and then we can say that, okay, when we get a 302, then that means, then we can describe it. So we can do description. And guys, everything here is down here, but I'm just showing you like a standard way you might do it. So you can see like here, description and all this stuff. So for the description, then we can say something like redirects permanently. Also, we can return a 404, and this can be thrown when the record was not found, or when the tag or that short URL was not found. When that short URL was not found in our DP. Okay, so this looks good to me. I'm gonna go ahead and save this file here, and then we run back our Flask app. So we'll do Flask run. So we need to change our config to use development again. So I'm gonna go to our flaskenv and change this one to development. Stop our server, run it again. So we need to specify the swag here. Now here we're gonna provide a path. So we're gonna do docs/short_url.yaml just to make sure we have a valid path. And now if we come back here and refresh, it's still failing. Let's take a look at why. The way we are defining our responses, we need to make sure that this is behind. So we have responses. Oh, we need to have this here. Yeah, so you want to make sure your YAML is formatted properly. Okay, so now we just need to make sure that our things are correct. So we have this simple description, we have the tags, we have this, we have our responses, which should look good. So I'm gonna go back to the server, and now you can see that it loads without an error. And yeah, and we have the documentation for the /short URL route, and we have even a way to try it. So the authorize button is when we specify that we are using the bearer token in the Swagger config. Now what I want to do here is, instead of me going and doing things scratch, these YAML files are prone to me making errors. So I'm going to show you how you can add like the one for login. So just a sec, I'm going to bring it in. So to make like the one for login, the one that makes a post request, I'm going to bring in this, and then over here you can see that we have a simple description, then we have the tags. So the tags are used to group these endpoints inside like this. So you can see that the short URL is grouped under bookmarks. So you can see that now we define the parameters. Then for the name, we say, okay, in the body we expect some things. So we require a username and a password, and then we give an example of how it should look, and we can show some example responses. Now you just need to make sure that your YAML file is formatted properly, and these keys are the ones that we should expect. So now to add this to our route, we can go to our auth, and then where we have login. So here we have login, we can have swag from. So let's import swag from Flask. So from Flask. So where we have the login, we can have swag from, we can have add swag from, and then we define the path. So our path here is going to be docs/auth/login.yaml. So let's save that. And now, if we come back here and refresh, you can see that we have the authentication added, and because of the tags, it is grouped. The URLs are grouped alone. But if I went ahead to, let's say here in the login, if I went ahead and changed this one to bookmarks and saved and refreshed here, you're going to see that now everything is under bookmarks. So that's what tags are. They basically allow you to separate and group related endpoints together. So let me also bring in the registration. It should be quite similar to the login. So here I'm going to have register.yaml. So it can be YAML like this or YAML like this. So now it should be the same thing, just that here we expect 3 things and they are all required. We have an example in there and the example responses. So let's save that. Now we need to, of course, add it we need to have the swag from decorator. So I'm going to copy this, and here you can also have it, and this should be register.yaml. And if we come over here and refresh, you can see that register is also added. Now I'm going to add some few ones for the bookmarks. Then I'm going to leave you guys to add the other ones, because the format, now you guys have the format. So I'm going to go ahead and add one that can allow us to get the stats. I'm going to create a folder called stats, a file called stats YAML, like this. And then it's going to be bookmark stats. We expect the user to be authenticated. So we say, okay, the authorization header is required. And these are the sample responses. So you can either send back this or the bookmarks themselves. So now, if we go to our app, if we go to our bookmarks, we can have swag from, which should import here. We need to be able to go to our stats and also add the swag from. So here we can have a swag from, we define the path, docs, bookmarks, stats. And if we save this, so if we take a look here, you can see that it is tagged under bookmarks. And also let's make it YAML, just so we have all our files are consistent. So let's rename it here, YAML. Let's save here. Let's try again. Now you can see that it is added here, and things are good. Whenever we define a documentation like this, it's going to have a spec. Now, like we said, now we are basing on the OpenAPI spec. Sometimes it's called the Swagger spec. So this is one that can be understood by even other documentation tools. Now, if you look here, we have the API spec.json. So with this, we can be able to export this documentation into other tools. So I'm going to go to Postman here. And with Postman, you see you can have, in the file, you can have the import option. So with the import, you can import this documentation using our link. So we need to go to /API spec.json, but that is just a relative to our domain. So we are going to go to our app and then enter the spec URL, and then we can click continue. And then it's going to detect that, oh, this is a valid documentation. Then we can import it in as a documentation. I'm going to click OK. And when I do that, we'll get an API and a correction imported. Then I'm going to close here. And when this refreshes, you can see that now we have the bookmarks API. And yeah, so down here, if we click on this, we should be able to see the documentation. So the more we add more docs, more endpoints on here, the more we can get more when we export. So for the collection, if I click on correction, we have this new bookmarks API, and this can be used to test out APIs really fast. So that is the basics of how we can document our simple API. Now I'm looking forward to creating more tutorials that will use Flask RESTful, and we're going to be seeing how we can work with Flask RESTful and the API documentation. So if this video helped you, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one, where we are going to be, I remember something I wanted to share. Yeah, where we're going to be deploying this application to a live server. So thanks guys for watching. Talk soon. Hey guys, welcome to the last video in the series. So in this one, we're going to be deploying our Flask application to Heroku. That way we can share a URL to other developers, and they can build apps for our API. So to get started, we are going to need to first change a few things. One is we are going to need a Git repository. So Heroku uses Git to manage deploys. So you want to make sure you're using Git for local version control. And in our case, we are going to be using GitHub. So make sure you have a GitHub account that you can push your code to. So I'm going to be showing you a process on how we can do that. Now, here in my terminal, this is our project. And to iterate, we have the danda init py file. So that is where our application lives. We have the create app factory function. So to get started, I'm going to stop the server here. Now, the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to first get a server that will serve our application on Heroku. So in our case, we are going to be using gunicorn. So I'm going to install it quickly here by doing pip install gunicorn. and that's going to go ahead and install it. So now we have that. So with Heroku, we can be able to customize how it runs our applications through using a file called procfile. So in the root of our projects, I'm going to specify a file called procfile. Now you can see that that has the Heroku version there. So what we need to change here is we need to specify the command that's going to run our application. Now since we've installed gunicorn, we're going to be making it run our application. So we'll do gunicorn. So you type gunicorn and then you type a path to your application. So our path for now is danda init. So what I want to do is here in our root, I'm going to create a file called runner.py, and this is going to be meant for just deployment. So here we can import our app. Okay, so here we can define app application equals create app. Then we're going to instantiate it because that is how it gets assigned to the app we want to run. So we want to run this application now with gunicorn, and we can do that by specifying a path. So in our case, it's going to be in source.runner, then the application. So we can specify that by doing src runner then the name of our main application is called application. To test this one out, I'm going to copy this command, and inside the terminal here, I'm going to paste it. So this is how Heroku is going to run this. Notice that when I paste the command here, the exact command that we want Heroku to run, we get a server started, and by default it's going to start on the default HTTP port. So in our case, we can see that when we run this, we get a gunicorn running, and then we get this link here. So when I click this, you can see that it has the same version as our development server. Now, of course, when you're deploying, you want to also take care of some things. For example, if you had a DB you want to connect to on production, you would do that. But in our case, we're just going to keep our SQLite DB since we already have it. So we're going to commit it to Git, and we just keep it working like that. But you'll have to have like a database setup if you're using something else like MySQL or Postgres. So now that we have this, the next thing we're going to need to do is to tell Heroku which dependencies our application needs. So I'm going to stop the server. Now, since we are using pip, we can use pip freeze to create a file that has our dependencies. So that file, we're going to call it requirements.txt. So if we do this, we get the requirements.txt file created, and it has all our project dependencies. So now that we are done with that, then we can create a Git repository for our project. Now, since we don't have any Git repositories initiated locally yet, we're going to start by creating it on GitHub because we're going to need to push to GitHub. So over here, I'm going to click New Repository. I'm going to call our application Bookmarker API. So once we have that, then I'm just going to create it. It's going to be public. And this is where all the source code for the series is going to go by. Now that we've created it, I'm going to copy these default commands they give me. And to make it quick, I'm just going to put it here. So that's going to initialize a Git repository locally. And it's going to push a default file, which is README now. So if I refresh on GitHub, we should have the README. You can see we have the README. So the next thing I'm going to need to do now is to actually push our code. But like I was saying, we need to first also change our environment just so we can change that we are now running to in production. So what we're going to do here is the Flask app, we shouldn't mind it. Everything here is going to be used for development. Our runner process is going to be running our app differently since we set it up to use gunicorn. So we can keep these, and then in Heroku, I'm going to show you how you can add them dynamically. So over here, now we are going to git checkout. I'm going to create another branch because I want this to come through a pull request. So I'm going to call this one deploy app. Then we can add the changes. So git add everything. So before we add everything, we have a .env file, and we don't have a .gitignore file. So I'm going to go online here to .gitignore gitignore.io. So this helps us to quickly create gitignore files for the common technologies. So here, if I put in Flask and click create, you can see that we get like a general .gitignore file. So let me create it here, gitignore. So I'm going to bring in all this. Now, let me remove this. So this should be able to hide our virtual environments and everything that should be sensitive. So if we do a git status, we should be able to see that we have all these files. Now we need to remove our .env, this main.env that has things we shouldn't commit. So over here we can remove it by doing git rm cached.env. You can see it gets removed. So if we do a git status again, you can see that it's gone. So now we can go ahead and add this change to the staging area and then commit everything. So git add.git ignore, and then let's commit. So git commit -m for the message deploy app. So now we can do a push to GitHub. So I'm gonna come over here and use this set upstream just so all our subsequent pushes go to this branch. So now I'm gonna click on the create a pull request link, and I'm just gonna create it. Normally you want to fill out all this just so maybe if you need to check something in the future, you can track back and see, okay, what was I thinking at this point in time? So I'm just gonna merge it for now. If we get any issues, we are gonna come back and actually resolve them. So now when we push to main, you can see that we have a requirements file which Heroku is gonna need, and also we have the Flask env. Now for the Flask env, we're gonna need to switch them in Heroku, so don't worry about these ones being here. So now in Heroku, we can come here and create a new app. So I'm gonna call this one, how did you call it on GitHub? Let me check. Just wanna make sure it is the same. Doesn't really matter. Just make sure you have a name, and if it's available, then good for you. So I'm just gonna say rest at the end. Then I'm gonna click create app. So when we create app, we can go to the deploy section. We want to click connect to GitHub. If you hadn't authenticated before, it's gonna tell you to log in. So after you log in, you're gonna have your accounts here, and then we want to search for the one we want to deploy to. So when I type in Bookmarker API, you can see that it comes through, and then I can click connect. So when I click connect, it's gonna go and run. Now it gets the branches. Then we are gonna go ahead and deploy this branch. So I'm gonna go ahead and click deploy branch, and then it's gonna go ahead and now start installing the things it needs. So it's gonna detect that we are running Python, and then it's gonna go ahead and start installing things in requirements.txt. So now that the deployment is done, we're gonna see that the app was successfully deployed. If we click on view, it's going to open up in a new tab, and right away you can see that we have a title that we would want to see. So that means our application was able to be deployed and it's being served. So after that, you're gonna see that now it gets ahead to be rendered here. Now things are not gonna be working yet because we still need to do some config. For example, you see if I try to make a call, you can see that we get this error. In fact, I'm gonna copy this and go to Postman. So in Postman, I'm gonna make another request. It's gonna be a post. So if we try to do this, you can see that we get a 500, and we actually don't get more errors since now we are running in a production environment. So what we need to do is to actually set up these environments. So the way Heroku does it is for the things we define in Flask env, they try to look for them in their environment inside our Heroku. So to set the secret key, we need to have something that is really secret and that can be hard to guess. So I'm gonna go to my terminal, and then I'm gonna use this utility that is provided on the Flask website. So what it does is basically import OS, and then it uses OS to give us, and then it gives us a 16 random string that we can use. So I'm just gonna copy this format here, and then inside Heroku, you want to go to settings. So when you go to settings, then you will see config vars. So for this, then we need to set the keys. So this is gonna be secret underscore key. Then the other things we need to set are the SQL alchemy URL. So go back to Heroku, let's add this. So let's set the SQL alchemy DB URL. It's gonna be the same because we can use the same. If you're using something like MySQL or Postgres, you're gonna have your own DB URL. In fact, if you're using Postgres, Heroku kind of gives you the DB URL directly, even when you deploy for the first time. And that's the one you want to put here. So let's go ahead and also add our URL. So let's also add our JWT secret. So copy this. So for this secret, it can be anything. So this time we are not going to generate 16, let's generate 8. So we get this. We just copy any parts, any substring is okay. Just have something to work with. And now when we save this and we go back to our postman, so since they don't give us a lot of information, I'm going to go to the body and send like real data. So I'm going to click row, then I need to choose JSON. So then in here, now we can send the username. So let's have username as username. Let's have the password as the username. Doesn't matter. Then for the email, just going to have something that is invalid. So if I try to send this, notice that we get email is not valid. And this signifies that our API is actually working. So I'm going to go ahead and make a valid email. So gmail.com, send this, username is taken. So let's use username 56, send this. Now you can see user created. So I'm just going to go to the login endpoint just to make sure that we can log in. And you can see that we can log in, we get the access token and the refresh token, meaning that our JWT secret key is being picked up. So I'm going to pick this. So I'm going to go to a new URL, and here I'm going to try to access the bookmarks. So those are on bookmarks. Now we need to send our JWT that we got on login. So I'm going to copy this here from access. Then in the auth, we want to pick bearer token. Then we want to send our bearer token. Forget the one that was pre-filled in mine. Sometimes it gets pre-filled, but just put your new one. So you can see that we get our results being sent back to us. If we go to body and do a poster, and we need to post JSON, of course. So we need to send a URL and then the body. So let's try to send this. So you get the URL is not valid. Now I'm just going to pick a random URL on the internet. So let me just get a random one. Let me pick this here. So I'm going to go to Postman. Let's send a URL. Here, let me put Flask docs. So if I go ahead and click send, you can start to get it created. Now, if we go and do a get again, you can start to get it listed. So that means that our API is even working, even on prod. And also we have our short URL. So now, if I went to our Flask app, here / this URL, and by the way, if you guys ever wondered how URL shorteners work, imagine we had a domain that was like abc.com. It would mean that we are able to translate any URL into less than 7 characters. So imagine we had like Bookmarks API Heroku app was like abc.com. So that's how they do it. Now here, if we try to get this, we expect to be taken to this Flask config, and that is what's happening. So our progression is up and running. There might be some things that are not working good. So if you guys ever find an issue, be sure to leave a comment and people are going to be happy to take a look. So thanks guys for watching. I hope this was helpful. If it was, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to sub. I'll talk to you later.